This is the Tesoro AI podcast with Darius Gant. AI is changing the world and fast. This episode is coming to you courtesy of Tesoro AI, the #1 recruiting service for software development and AI talent.
All right, Guru, welcome to the show. I appreciate you taking out some time to join us.
Darius, I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's kick things off and talk a bit about your background and kind of professional interest in AI. Where did it come from? What are some of the experiences that you've had on the AI side prior to the startup that you launched? We'll get there, but we want to learn a little bit about you before.
Thank you. Yeah, so when it comes to AI, Darius, I've been in this space for a couple of decades now. And you said, hey, how did I get into it? I'll share a little story. When I was in high school, I wouldn't say I was a great chess player, but I liked playing chess and I played chess and so on. And I don't know if any of members of the audience will remember this, but there was a moment in 97, late 90s, I think it was 97, when Deep Blue, IBM's chess program, was that, yeah, it seems to ring a bell for you, beat Garry Kasparov. And it was just a very monumental thing, right? Like chess was one of those things that everyone thought, hey, machines can't do that as well as humans. It's creative work, right? Like, and that captivated me. And so actually, when I went to college at Stanford, in my CS program, I studied AI, right? And at that time, it was very different. It was expert systems.
Right.
It wasn't deep learning neural networks that we have today. Those techniques were around, but the problem with the data and the compute wasn't anywhere near what you have today. And you need the data and the compute to make deep learning algorithms really work well, right? So it was a very different kind of methodology. And so I studied that, and then I continued to study that in my academic days. I got a PhD in economics and was a professor for a while. And my research centered around AI's implications on business, on the workforce, on skills, on jobs, and also starting to look at things like, hey, where can it go wrong? Where is it biased? How can it, mess up and those kinds of things? And so continue to spend that time in academia and then pivoted to, and I just thought there was so much fun stuff to do in the corporate world around AI. And so pivoted to the corporate world. And that's kind of what led me here. I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but that's how my interest in AI originally got started. And I've continued to work in this space to this day.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about your experience with Capital One? I think it's interesting kind of getting some perspective on like, what is it like when you're working in that space within a larger enterprise?
Yeah, absolutely. So Capital One, I spent the last 6-7 years at Capital One. And Capital One has been, so when people talk about AI, I want to kind of start with maybe a little definition here. I think a lot of people's head goes to Gen AI, right? Because that's what they've seen recently and that's what they associate with. But if you think about AI as any kind of technological system that can learn and draw inferences and make predictions, we've had AI for a while, right? We've had machine learning algorithms for a while now that operate under that construct. And so Capital One was building machine learning algorithms in the late 80s. I mean, it started off simple, right? Like you start off with simple regression models, logit models, that kind of stuff. And then you build more and more complicated machine learning algorithms. But that was Capital One's whole entry into the financial services space, was to disrupt how lending is done, right? And predicting who's going to be a good lender and all that kind of stuff. And so Capital One started building these models, but because, lending and banking are very regulated, Darius, they had to be very thoughtful around risk management around their models, right? And so I think that's very relevant for what we'll be talking about, over the course of this conversation, is they have just built out one of the kind of premier risk management, AI risk management capabilities and practices anywhere. And as an executive at Capital One leading AI teams, I had to learn that. And it's funny, my initial reaction as someone who loves building AI is like, this is just going to slow me down. This is frustrating. I don't like governance. This is frustrating, right? And so for people who knew that version of me, it's kind of funny for them to see what I'm doing now. But that was my initial reaction until I realized, hey, if you mess up, that's actually going to set you back several years.
Yeah.
Right. And so you actually got to bring governance in to be able to run faster. Right. And that was kind of one of my important insights during my time at Capital One.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about AI in the enterprise, right? I think, people think AI is everywhere. Everyone's using it, particularly because you have, quote unquote, a lot of people using ChatGPT and some of the other LLMs, which from my experience, most people still aren't using these unless you're kind of a techie type person.
Yes.
I'll show friends who I've even introduced, hey, watch me use ChatGPT 4.40, right? And they're like, oh, cool. And then 2 weeks later, have you tried it? No, I haven't tried it. But I think that same idea applies to the enterprise. And I think on the enterprise side, it's not that folks don't want to use AI. There's just other implications when you're a bigger business and, the government is saying, hey, look, go ahead. But there could be some repercussions if things go wrong.
That is spot on, right? And so when you think about enterprise, you have to think about risk management. I mean, these are large, especially large companies, right? And you've seen some examples of this. I don't know if you're familiar. Do you know about the Air Canada lawsuit?
Yeah, the Air Canada. Yeah, but you can go ahead and lay it out.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting precedent, right? And very reasonable precedent and set of occurrences here. So Air Canada had built a chatbot, an AI chatbot off of kind of foundational models. I don't know the specifics of what they did. I don't know if they just took it off the shelf or if they fine-tuned it or what they did, but they had a chatbot that leveraged a vendor foundational model, and it started interacting with customers. And customers were talking to it, asking questions about policies as you and I would, right? If I go on a website, I'll be like, what is the baggage policy or what is whatever, right? And so a customer had asked about the refund policy and was told something that ended up being completely incorrect. It was hallucinating, right? And so we'll talk about hallucinations and stuff later, but it basically made it up. And so they went ahead and acted on that information, bought a ticket, and later tried to get a refund and were told no.
Right.
And so one thing led to another, and they filed a lawsuit. And what was interesting was, look, the amount itself wasn't huge for a company, but what they tried to argue was, hey, this is somebody else's, because they had leveraged a vendor model.
Right.
And the legal precedence that was set here is, no, it doesn't matter if you're using vendor models, you're still responsible, Air Canada. And so that's the kind of thing. And Air Canada obviously was all over the news, reputational implications, business implications. And so for a large company, they need to figure this stuff out. In fact, when I talk to my customers or when you look at the research reports, Darius, there's a lot of POCs, proof of concepts going on everywhere, right? Proof of concepts up, galore. But no, very few are productionizing it.
Right.
Your point, very few are production because they're still like, this is risky. We don't know what this thing will do if you just unleash it talking to like any person out there, right?
Yeah.
And so that issue of trust and risk management is a big impediment right now to adoption.
Well, and I think that case is also interesting from the perspective that Air Canada tries to push responsibility down to the vendor, where the regulators are saying, no, you use the technology, so the responsibility is yours. And so what then ends up happening is now, even if you're a vendor, right? If you are a vendor, a startup vendor who's trying to sell into the enterprise, there's going to be some level of diligence that goes into enterprise readiness of your AI solution so that they can use it, because ultimately your customer as a vendor holds responsibility.
That's an absolutely accurate insight, right? And we're seeing this. We have AI vendors come to us and say, hey, look, we're starting to get questions from our enterprise customers, from a potential RFP that we're a part of. And it's slowing down our sales cycles. We got to answer questions around risk management, around bias audits, around regulatory compliance, around data privacy. And so help us answer those questions, right? So you're starting to see companies, they're still in the early stages, but you're starting to see them inject this into their RFP, into their procurement processes. And that has implications for vendors.
I think that makes it a lot interesting for startups and folks building products for the enterprise, because now you've got an additional level. If I were selling a software product into, if it's a B2C product, right? I could build it one way, but if I'm selling it to the enterprise, there's a lot more scrutiny that goes into it.
Completely.
Right. So now the AI piece, I'm like, dang, I got even more I got to think about as I build. But I do want to talk about FairNow and kind of as you've had this experience at Capital One, you decided, hey, I've recognized that there's a serious problem in the market where we need to create a solution. We'd love for you to talk about what that pain point, what that problem is, and then we'll get into the solution.
Yeah. It's actually a really good segue because it's related to what we were just talking about. When I was there as an executive, you can imagine I get pitched all the time on AI products, AI technologies, all this kind of stuff. And when we would dig in, I had a pretty sophisticated team. And so when we would dig in, we would probe on a whole set of dimensions. And this is like even 2-3 years ago, Darius. So you can imagine then it was even less sophisticated, some of these vendors around thinking about thinking about governance and thinking about testing and monitoring and governance and all these things. And so when we probed deeply, we found them to be lacking on these dimensions. And so we were not going to buy them, right? But that made me realize, hey, there's a need out there, because this is creating a market failure where companies are building these technologies, enterprises are not willing to buy them because they're going to be worried about the risk. And so there needs to be a way, if we can solve that tension, then that's going to increase innovation, right? And that's going to increase innovation and adoption and all of that kind of stuff. And so that was the thesis that we had. There's a real need here on both sides of the market to make this work. And so, a few of us, ex-Capital One, half of our team's ex-Capital One, so we decided, hey, let's go launch FairNow. And again, the premise here is there's a need to be able to demonstrate trustworthiness, to be able to demonstrate compliance, to be able to demonstrate governance. And that's the solution that we're building.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to just observe the market, right? And see trustworthiness, governance, compliance. Those are the things that are really the bottleneck for AI deployment. So you see these statistics around how many billions or trillions are going to be invested in AI. And it's like, yeah, the number is great, but if we don't ever get this trustworthiness, compliance, enterprise readiness, and I don't even want to just say enterprise, but just readiness, how that number is probably overstated. How did you think about, so FairNow, how does it solve the problem practically?
Yeah, a couple of different dimensions, right? So one is we understand governance, like what all the components of governance. And, if you're interested, we can kind of delve into those details. But good governance has a couple components to it. Some of those components are related to policies and processes and, actions, procedures, and that kind of stuff. And some of it's related to technology. Like, are you actually inventorying your models? Do you know what they do? And do you have an inventory and a catalog? Mm-hmm. Do you actually test your models, right? So there's some things that are just process related. Hey, what is our policy, Darius, at our company on data privacy? What is our policy around AI ethics, and where will we not use it, right? Those are kind of things that humans have to do in conversations and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to inventorying, when it comes to approval and governance flow, when it comes to testing, those can be done through a technology, and it's better and faster to do a technology. So there are many aspects of governance that actually you want to automate.
Okay.
And so that's the part we have taken and pulled that into a platform. Because if you do governance without automation or without the help of a technology, let me tell you, Darius, it is painful. Okay. It's a lot of manual work. It's a lot of person hours. And so this was the pain point we saw at Capital One, where, again, governance is something it was very much part of the culture, but man, it took up a lot of time. Like, I would talk to data scientists and say they spend about 30 to 40 to 50% of their time just doing governance as opposed to building models.
Right.
And so if that's the case, how do you reduce that friction? How do you automate more of it? And so that's kind of why we have this platform.
And really, to bring it home, can you give us an example of, you mentioned the data scientists spending 40 to 50% of their time. Like, what are some of the tasks that they have to do as it relates to some of this governments or ensuring compliance?
Yeah, let me give you a couple of examples, right? So one is, you have to be able to, an important part of governance is stopping and thinking, why are you building what you're building? Mm-hmm. And what are the benefits and value, and what are the risks, right? And often you have to write documentation around that. And if you look at all these like standards, like NIST framework, the EU AI Act, California's law, they all kind of require, right? These are kind of classical governance paradigms, right?
Right.
You have to document things and so on and so forth. There's a lot of aspects of documents that people are just writing over and over again, right? And there's ways of simplifying that, of automating that. So kind of automating the documentation of things is something that you can save a lot of time on. So that's one, right? The second piece is, how do you verify that what you're doing is adding up to some kind of compliance program? Mm-hmm. Where is that? Is that on your local Excel file? Like, how are you communicating that with the different stakeholders, right? Is it just a bunch of emails going back and forth and meetings? Like there's that whole like process component. And you can simplify that by having that standardized and centralized on a platform. So for instance, when I complete my step, right? Let's say I'm a data scientist, I complete my step, and you're the person who needs to approve it, right? Automatically, the platform has logic in it. It automates aspects of it, and it sends you a notification. You can come in and see it, and not just you, but maybe your colleague, the risk officer, can come see it. It's all in one place. And you start to simplify and centralize things. That also reduces a lot of frictions. So those two things of automating documentation and centralizing and simplifying I think, can go a long way to reducing the manual work.
Yeah. And so are you seeing this more, I guess, folks who are actually adopting these policies, who I should say, folks who are actually trying to stay in compliance? I think everyone wants trustworthiness, but depending, you might throw that out the window if you're a star. I shouldn't speak for them, but compliance, right? Governance. Are you seeing that more? Like what part of this AI ecosystem are you seeing folks care more about that?
Yep. I'd probably bucket it into a couple of categories. One is organizations that are in regulated industries.
Mm-hmm.
So financial services, health, medical, and HR are three that come to mind, because those are organizations and companies that are quite regulated. Okay. And if they make a mistake, it's pretty high risk. You're talking about people's careers, their finances, and their health, right? So even if there wasn't a regulation, your reputation takes a huge hit if you end up doing something, right? So I see more companies in those industries caring about it. So that's number one. Number two, I do see large companies caring about it. This is relevant to your last point, because they're the ones who both have the resources, right, and think about risk management and are more likely to get sued, and et cetera. If you're a small to medium-sized company, you're just probably less likely to get sued. You're less likely to get audited. You're less likely to have the regulators come at you, right? So that's more larger companies. And then vendors, even smaller vendors, right? And that's because it's not about the regulation. It goes back to the previous point I was making, where they want to differentiate themselves in the sales cycle. And so if their enterprise customer is asking questions and they can move faster, right, and win it, like imagine you're a startup, right? And you're competing against an incumbent in the space, and your products are pretty equivalent or whatever. How can you differentiate? Well, if you can say, hey man, I can answer these questions tomorrow, today, I can potentially win this deal. Well, that's a motivation for me to be able to have governance.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thinking of someone who's, hey, we just raised our Series A, we're trying to sell into the enterprise. One way for you to break in relative to everyone else who's in this space is, okay, well, when you actually go through this procurement process and they ask you these questions, right, you have the right answer.
That's right.
So how does, and you alluded to it a bit, but if I'm your customer, how would I actually be then engaging with, you mentioned a platform, how would I be engaging with the platform? What kind of interface am I working with? Is there an interface? Like what actually happens on the customer side?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. We have 3 modules. And so we have some customers use kind of end to end, and some are using one or two of the modules. And so I'll just describe the 3 modules. One, the basic one is really around the governance, like inventorying your models. So so we have customers now where we help them a little bit onboarding onto the platform, where we say, hey, what are all the models you have, AI technology systems you have in your company, vendor or internal, and let's start onboarding them onto the platform. And so that there's a whole process, like the platform takes you through it step by step, and you say, okay, I have a prediction model. Let's pull that in. And then it asks you a series of questions around that model. Like, hey, what kind of data does it use? What's the purpose of this model? Is it built off of any vendor models? Is it a Gen AI system? It asks you a bunch of questions. What's the risk on this? What geographies do you use? Right. So we have a whole framework. We ask you a set of questions, and then that allows us to give you a couple of insights. One, what are the risks of this model? Right. And 2, what laws are in scope? And based on that, we give you a set of recommendations of, hey, this is what you need to do to be well managed on this. Yeah. Right. So that's one thing that they can just do right off the bat. And we recommend that for anyone. That's just a good way. It's good hygiene. And it's a really good way to just manage your risks. You know what you have inside your companies. You don't want people running around using ChatGPT, entering in all sorts of data, and you have no clue. Right. So that's kind of one way to start using the platform. The second thing is, well, for certain types of models, you probably need to run some tests, right? Some kind of evaluation, like, is it biased? Is it hallucinating, right? Like, you want to be able to test those things, right? And so you can perform those tests on the platform, Okay, so that's another that's another module we have. And then the third thing is, okay, now you're saying, okay, I'm in Europe or I'm in New York State or California, and these are all places that are either have regulations or are going to have regulations soon. Okay, how do I know I'm compliant? So then you can go to our compliance module, and there you can track different things. Okay, so to be compliant with Europe, you need to do these 30 things. Okay, you can track that on the platform, and you can ensure that you're compliant if you ever get audited. So those are the three ways you can, interact with our platform and use the capabilities.
Yeah, and you spoke a bit about some, document automation being one particular use case where, sounds like you're going to use AI for that process, but we'd love to hear some more use cases on the FairNow side where AI is actually powering your platform.
Yep. There's going to be a couple different, we're working through this right now. So one of them is on the testing side.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine you're trying to do a bias test on a Gen AI technology. We actually use AI ourselves, Gen AI ourselves in that process. So without going too much into the secret sauce, we actually leverage Gen AI ourselves to do some of the testing. But it is a combination of classical statistics techniques, Gen AI plus human involvement. Like we're not at the point yet where we're completely ready to automate it because we need to have our own humans on our side spot checking, doing checks, and being in the loop on the testing. So, but that is a place where we're leveraging statistics, machine learning, and AI. So that's Gen AI. So that's one area. The other one is document automation. So absolutely, right? So this is in our roadmap. We're working on this right now. But being able to, for instance, read, companies can store their policies on our platform.
Right.
Okay. Being able to read those policies, understand what they're saying, and then check if you're doing those things on the platform, right? And so so we're building technology around that, right? So those are the kinds of things we're starting to use on our own end. A third one is, again, something we have in our pipeline, have our own Gen AI chatbot where customers can ask any kind of governance question, anything around regulations, governance, and then that chatbot can answer those questions. So those are like three different examples, Darius, where we're going to have AI embedded in our own product.
And is it that a customer will already, because you mentioned a few different industries that are more apt to use these type of applications, platforms, healthcare, financial services, I forget the other one.
HR, yeah.
HR, okay. And is it that they're going out and finding the regulations that they need to adhere to? Or is it on your end, you are actually going out, determining what the regulations are, and then ensuring that they are in compliance?
It's the latter. It's the latter, right? And so what we're doing is we track every single law, every single regulation that could be relevant to AI. And like I said, remember the first thing I said is when they interact with our platform, they inventory their AI. We ask a bunch of questions. And so based on the answers to those questions and the metadata that we capture, we're able to figure out which laws apply to which of their models.
Right.
And so then we tell them, oh, this new model that you inventoried, it's in scope for the Utah law and the New York City law. I'm making this up, right? And then we say so now this is what you need to do to get compliant. So we give them that insight.
Got it. No, that's super helpful. So, as you thought about building out the platform itself, right? You got this software element, you also got this intelligent element with some of the AI that you're building out as well. Did you code this up? I'm curious, who'd you have to bring on to get this thing built?
Look, I coded a long time ago. You don't want me coding. I mean, it is fascinating, right? Like software engineering is one of those places where you leave for a couple of years and it has changed. The landscape, the methodologies, the code, and look, you can always get back into it, but it is fast moving. And now you're already starting to see, you've probably seen this. I think there was something called Devin. Have you seen that? Where now it's another revolution in engineering, right? Where people who are going to be able to leverage AI to become better coders themselves, right? So trust me, you don't want me coding. But that being said, I have an amazing CTO, a gentleman, Steve Denton, who's been a veteran in the startup world, in the AI world, in the B2B world, and so he has built out an engineering team at FairNow, and so they're the ones building this awesome platform.
Yeah. And then and maybe pull me out of the weeds if I get too deep into the weeds here. But when you thought about, the type of folks that you need to bring in from an AI perspective, like that technical skill, whether it be the data scientists or machine learning engineers, were you more focused on folks who had, practical knowledge or I should say practical experience delivering AI solutions, or did you have to go more on the research side where folks could go look at, new and innovative ways to solve some of the problems that you all are trying to solve?
Yes, that's a really good question, actually, because that is something we are literally talking about right now, right? Because especially, like you've been an entrepreneur and you understand how critical, I mean, you have limited resources,
Right.
and you got to be really judicious and thoughtful about every hire you make, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be very particular about what skills we're looking for, and then also how these skills fit together on our team. And so to your point, we have engineers on our team and we have data scientists, and it's always a thing of like, hey, which one is the bottleneck, right?
Right.
Which one is slowing down our work? Is it the engineering side? Okay, we need to go hire an engineer. Or are we not moving fast enough on the data science side? Then we need more data science resources. So it's always a balance, and it's always a conversation we're having internally. Right now, it's probably more on the engineering side. So we need to go hire engineers that can build. To your question around, look, some of the data science work is really cutting edge, right? So we're looking at academic papers, we're talking to academics and other researchers on some of these topics. The engineering work, even though it's not like that academic, it's still pretty new. Some of it is pretty cutting edge still, right? Like you're talking about how do you test AI systems? How do you test Gen AI systems, building the back end and the platforms and the integrations to be able to do this? Some of these are new techniques, even on the engineering side. And so you do want people who have some experience in this new world, so to speak, right? And so we do look for that.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think about, here's a statistic out, and this is me thinking about, talent acquisition. There's a statistic out that at least in North America, the machine learning engineers, AI talent, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the amount of equity that they have requested, it's like 3x what it used to be. Right. And, my question is not about like compensation. It's about, just actually going out there and, because they can only ask that if there is more demand than there is
supply.
Right.
That's right.
So, as you think about how you actually go out and find the right people for FairNow, what's worked for you and what hasn't worked for you? Curious about that.
It is a challenge, right? It is unequivocally true that there is more demand than supply right now for that type of talent, right? Specifically for AI type of talent, both ML engineering, AI ops, Gen AI ops, and the data science side as well. And the challenge is, some of these big companies can pay. You probably know this data better than I do, Darius, but like Facebook, NVIDIA.
Yeah, they're all like outliers. You kind of, they'll just write a check.
Exactly, right? Like you're talking, they'll pay us up to 7 figures
right
for this kind of talent. And so we obviously can't compete with that.
Right.
Obviously, you hope, and that's probably also not the type of person you want to compete with. We want to compete with folks who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to build a business, who want to build technology from the ground floor and stuff like that. So it is it's an apples and oranges comparison. But that being said, this kind of talent is very expensive. Both from a cash standpoint and from an equity standpoint. And that is something we're wrestling with.
Yeah. Have you did you build the team? Is it in a specific geographic location? Have you looked remote? How'd you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So look, we live on the other side of 2020, 2021, right? Where kind of the paradigm shifted, right? And I'm not saying like, I think there's a hybrid model here, but I'll talk to you about what I mean by hybrid. It's not kind of how people have been talking about hybrid, but I do think what we're angling for is we're open to remote, but the hybrid is we'd like to have a couple of centers. Does that make sense?
Right, where it's remote, but remote in like it's close near a satellite office.
Yeah, exactly. And so like where we are right now, we have about half of our team in the DC, Northern Virginia area. And then we have, again, about half of our team in the Austin area. And that just kind of worked out that way, right? And so now that we have a little bit of critical mass in each, again, look, if we find great talent elsewhere, we're going to go after it, right?
Yeah.
But all else equal, let's try to build some center of mass around those two areas, because I do believe there's value in person. I do believe there's value, especially at a startup, right? Like those early days. Technology is great. We have Slack, we have this, we have that, all that's fine. But to be able to hang out in person, to be able to do that is just meaningful. So that's kind of our strategy. Look, we'll hire elsewhere too, but that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
Yeah. And so I want to change gears here, just kind of get back to the conversation around, getting into market, right? So this, AI, it's not new, but as you mentioned, most folks are still in the POC phase, fewer actual public deployments. So as you all thought about, and then I would say the governance conversation is even something that is relatively new. So I'm curious, as you think about, all right, well, who are the folks we want to talk to? What's going to be our strategy to go from our 0 to 1 as a startup?
Yeah. Look, I think there's a bunch of, and look, we're on that journey ourselves, right? So can't say we've figured that out in any complete way, but a couple of things. Look, enterprise sales is hard, right? And I think people who are founders, co-founders starting, it's just a different beast. It has its pros and cons relative to B2C, but enterprise sales is long, and there is a relationship component to it in a way that you might not even see kind of selling to smaller businesses or B2C for sure, right? And so it's like building that relationship with your buyer, like knowing who that buyer is, what's your ICP, and really understanding their motivations, right? What are they trying to achieve? And almost being like, hey, this is going to help you achieve your aspirations. And so one of the things we say is like, look, I believe, and I'd be curious your thoughts, I think there's going to be a whole ecosystem of jobs that are going to be around AI risk management and AI governance. It's like, even if you go on LinkedIn now, you're starting to see companies, looking for an AI governance expert, looking for an AI. You're starting to see people hire for that. And so the way we want to frame it for us is like, we want our platform and our software to enable these new crop of folks who are coming into these roles and are like, okay, what do I do? I don't know what to do, right? How do I get started? How do I implement my governance program, et cetera? And you're like, okay, great. You have an ambitious now, you have this thing that you need to achieve. Our platform can help you achieve that. So it's thinking through kind of where is the space going and how can your technology help not just the company, right? But that individual who's buying your software, how can it help them?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting in the same way that when companies were first able to list themselves on the stock exchange, right? There wasn't, the KPMGs, the Deloittes, the PwCs of the world to step in and do the audit until we needed the information to be accurate for investment purposes. Similar thing in AI where it's, at first, go ahead, just deploy what you want to deploy. And then you start to see things go wrong. And we're like, no, we need regulation.
Step back.
We need dedicated organizations. It'll be interesting to see, though, now that we're in the era of software and intelligent software, if rather than having the KPMGs, the Deloittes, it's, FairNow who's going to provide the audit, so to speak, of the AI rather than this, Fortune 500 person-driven company doing it when we had to look at binders of financial details. Interesting to look at it like that, and curious about, I want to get to this question before we then, I do have another question for you as it relates to governance, but curious about, your experience with any kind of fundraising, right? So, one, what's been your experience with fundraising? And two, from your perspective, have investors been aware of the importance or the coming importance of governance?
Yep. So my experience with fundraising, look, we just closed our seed round, which pretty excited about. So that's where we are today. Look, I think the VC market right now is mixed, right? Where it's not an easy fundraising environment, but at the same time, you do see randomly you hear stories of like, this company raised 50 million, 100 million, right? And it's like in very narrow AI spaces, right? So it's kind of like a weird market that way, right? It's kind of like a lot of else in the economy right now where the numbers look good, but then there's just like some weirdness, right? Like the unemployment rate is really low right now, but it is also hard to find a job, right? Like if you're unemployed, right? So it's like, it's kind of like that where there is a lot of investments, but it's still hard to raise, right? And so it's kind of like in pockets. And so that's kind of one thing we noticed. And then the other thing is, I do think there are a lot of VCs thinking about this space, right? And the reason for that is, if you broaden it, Darius, the GRC space is just huge, right? T, for your audience, is governance, regulations, and compliance. It's just a huge space, tens of billions of dollars type space. And you mentioned some companies, right? Like who are already in there, like the Big Four and that kind of stuff. And that's on the consulting side. Right. But if you look on the software side, huge, tons of big companies that are built out there. And so, and you see these analogies, right? And so for instance, cyber, okay, over the last decade, think about how much cyber governance has grown. Think about data privacy and data governance. Think about how much that has grown, right? And so a lot of people are looking at those examples of like those markets blowing up in the last decade And then just like us thinking, wait a second, AI governance is going to blow up over the next
Right.
decade. And so anybody who's been in the GRC space and understands kind of how that has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years is aware that this is coming.
Yeah, well, yeah, interesting. And, everyone wants to invest in mission critical software. So once governance becomes mission critical.
Once it becomes a thing, then boom, it's going
to
blow up.
Absolutely. Right. And given that we're on the conversation, I know there's a ton of things that we could discuss around governance, compliance, trustworthiness. I'm curious if there's anything top of mind for you that, we have not discussed that the world should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I would say is for companies, governance doesn't have to be hard, right? Like there's a lot of questions of hey, how do I get started and so on and so forth. So I'll just probably, if it's helpful for you, I'll just summarize this at least in a couple of buckets, right? So the first thing is model inventory, right? Just go ahead and inventory your AI assets. You need to know what you have, you need to be tracking it and collecting the right information about the purpose of it, what data it uses, and so on and so forth. So that's part one. Part two is, who are the humans involved? Who's building them? Who's approving them? Who is making decisions around them? You need to have some kind of human accountability structure and roles and responsibilities, okay? The third piece is having policies. What is your policy around data privacy? What is your policy around the use of AI? What is your policy around transparency? What are you willing to share with whom? For instance, any candidate who interviews at your company, are you going to let them know that they're interacting with an AI system, right? Those are policies that you need to have in your organization. Fourth is testing. You got to test these things. It's like taking your car into the shop every once in a while. You got to get it oil change. You got to get the wheels. You got to get it tested, right? Otherwise, these things, like you're aware of this, Darius, these models drift, they change over time. You're retraining them on different data and they change, their performance changes. And then the fifth thing is just make sure you're compliant with regulations. So to me, again, it doesn't have to be too complicated. It's those 5 things that you really need to think about.
Yeah, awesome. No, I'm sure that will be super helpful, just given the conversation right now is very relevant. I know with the last little bit of time, I do want to leave time for 2 things. One, anything coming up, I know we're nearing the end of Q2. Anything coming up for FairNow that you'd like to announce, let folks know. And then the second part of the question is for folks who want to learn more, whether it be investors. I know you just closed the seed round, but it could be investors. It could be folks who want to apply for a job, or folks who may want to even hit you up for a POC. Where can they reach you? Where can they find you? Where can they learn more?
Awesome. Well, thank you for those 2 questions and the opportunity to plug us. So number one, look, for those who aren't aware, the EU AI Act just officially passed. And this is a big deal. I'm sure you're familiar with GDPR from a couple of years ago. This is the equivalent of GDPR. It's going to be seismic. The regulations are pretty thorough and the fines are pretty large if you don't comply. And so any company that does business in Europe is going to really want to ensure that they're on the right side of the compliance with the EU AI Act. Now, companies will have 6 to 12 to 18 months to get in compliance. But again, it's something they should start thinking about now. And again, we can help with that. So that's one. And there's going to be other regulations coming up. The California, I expect just SB, I think 1047 just passed the one part of their legislative branch. So California is going to pass something. Again, history rhymes, right? If people who remember GDPR and CCPA, right? You're starting to see that same thing. And so the second half of this year, there's just going to be more and more momentum around regulations and so on and so forth. So companies should be starting to get, their act together on this stuff. And so that's where, we fit in, right? And so anyone who wants to interact with us, you can email me. My email is guru, GURU @fairnow.ai, or you can come to our website, www.fairnow.ai. And there's a lot of information there. We offer a lot of information there for free. We track all the laws so you can see kind of which laws are coming up, which ones are coming down the pipe, so you can get a sense of what, the regulatory landscape looks like. We give you a lot of recommendations on what, frameworks on what good governance looks like and what you should be doing. And then if you're interested, we are hiring. So if you're interested, we're looking for especially engineers and data scientists. So if you're looking, so you can apply through our website or through me, and we're looking for talent. And yeah, if anyone is looking to also get a solution, please reach out. Happy to partner with you and help you with your governance journey.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, yeah, definitely appreciate all of the insight, especially the 5 jewels you just dropped. Yeah, exactly. I think that'll be especially helpful. But again, appreciate you taking some time out to share all of this information, and we'll definitely have to stay in touch.
Darius, thanks for having me. Look, I enjoy listening to your podcast and your focus on AI. And I know governance is not the sexiest thing, right? And you do a lot more fun conversations on AI and stuff like that. But hopefully this was still informative and fun in a different way, because without governance, it's gonna slow down your business's journey and roadmap on AI. And hopefully this will help.
Hey,
Thank
in
you.
my former world as an investor, the best investments are the non-sexy ones.
Exactly.
All
Awesome. Well, thanks for
right,
having me, Darius.
absolutely, absolutely.